The year is 1945 and the war to save Europe is over. The victorious Allies have crushed the Nazi war machine, and as the secrets of the Reich are leaked to the world, stories of the horrible atrocities they committed on Jews, homosexuals, people with intellectual disabilities, and prisoners of war lay bare the true horror that was the Third Reich. Yet in the shadow of Nazi atrocities, the British intelligence services would set up a camp whose human rights violations would mirror many of those committed by the Nazis, a horrendous interrogation camp that turned men into living skeletons. In an interview in the early 2000s, surviving German citizens spoke of August 1st, 1945, the day that the British arrived at the small resort town of Bad Nendorf. The town had until then been occupied by what the Germans called easygoing American infantrymen. But with the arrival of the British, the Americans left. The British troops gave the orders to every civilian to be ready to evacuate the town in 90 minutes, leaving people with little time to gather what precious few possessions they still had after the long war. Many initially thought that the move was temporary and that they would soon be allowed to return home. But as the British troops began to put up barbed wire and tear out the fancy baths from the town's bathhouse, the realization that their former home was being turned into something else soon hit them. There would be no returning home, at least not for years to come. The British strung up barbed wire throughout the town center and tore out the doors to each of the bathhouse's cubicles, replacing them with large steel doors so as to turn them into cells. Even before the town had been evacuated fully, the first truckloads of prisoners had already begun arriving. Initially, most of the prisoners were former Nazi Party members or members of the much-hated SS, all rounded up so as to thwart any possibility of a Nazi insurgency in the rebuilding of post-war Germany. Many, however, were leading industrialists of the Nazi regime, tobacco importers, oil company bosses, and forestry owners who had benefited greatly from Hitler's rule. However, as the months passed, the prison population quickly grew to include a large number of suspected Soviet agents. As Germany was partitioned between East and West, and the first chills of the Cold War descended on Europe, many officers of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, were captured on spy missions and imprisoned in the camp. However, the anti-Soviet paranoia had also swept up a large number of German leftists and communist sympathizers. Others were simply German citizens who lived in the Russian zone and had been captured crossing the line. Some of these had come across offering to spy on Russians and were imprisoned on suspicion of being double agents. Others were normal people caught up in the great power struggle. One man who starved to death, Franz Osterreicher, had been arrested with forged papers while attempting to enter the British zone. His motivation? To find and be reunited with his gay lover. Another man, Walter Bergman, had offered to spy for the British, but because he spoke fluent Russian, he fell under suspicion and was imprisoned and tortured in an attempt to establish that he was a genuine defector. Bergman would die of starvation and lack of medical care. Yet other prisoners were locked up for no good reason at all. One prisoner who was a former diplomat remained locked up simply because during his incarceration he had learned too much about British interrogation methods. Fearing he would leave the camp and report on British methods to either the press or the Soviet intelligence services, the British decided instead to keep him locked up. Another person who was kept prisoner for 8 months had arrived there due to nothing more than a simple clerical error. A British inspector from Scotland Yard, Tom Hayward, would later be assigned to determine what exactly went down in this prison camp while being run by British intelligence, and his notes would go on to say that of the prisoners, there are a number against whom no offense has been alleged, and the only authority for their detention would appear to be that they are citizens of a country still nominally at war with us. Hayward's investigation would spill the secrets of Britain's most infamous prison camp and of its staggering human rights abuses. Observers noted that in his report to the government, anger and revulsion leapt from every page as he detailed the place where prisoners had been systematically beaten and exposed to extreme cold, starved to death, and tortured with instruments that the British intelligence officers had recovered from a Gestapo prison in Hamburg. During the British occupation, it was said that if you snuck up to the barbed wire fence at night, you could hear the screams of the prisoners inside. Others, however, say that the camp was the most sinister place on earth, precisely because of its dead silence, with one witness saying, "You never ever saw anyone, and you never heard a sound." Bad Nendorf quickly became known as Das Verbotendorf, the Forbidden Village. The commanding officer of the Bad Nendorf prison camp was Colonel Robin Tin Eye Stevens, who had previously commanded Camp 020 in Surrey, where the German spies had been interrogated during the war. Widely regarded as an authoritarian and a xenophobe with a legendary temper, Stevens boasted that interrogators who could break a man were born, not made. The camp would go on to employ 20 interrogators, 12 of whom were British. The other 8 were mostly German Jewish refugees who were purposefully recruited because of their expected ruthlessness selflessness toward the German and Soviet prisoners both, given how much the Jews had suffered at the hands of both powers. The guards who secured the facility were also largely made up of British Army soldiers who had received suspended sentences for assault or desertion, and as Scotland Yard Inspector Hayward would comment, they were the sort of individuals likely to resort to violence on helpless men. It is clear that the camp at Bad Nenndorf was carefully engineered to be as cruel as possible, down to the men who were employed to guard or interrogate the inmates within it. Those imprisoned there were frequently starved on purpose, woken up during the night, and then forced to walk up and down their cells from early morning until late at night, with breaks only for meals. Driven to the very edge of complete physical exhaustion, the process was thought to break the will of the prisoners so they could be more easily interrogated. When moving between different areas of the camp, the prisoners were expected to run, and if they failed to move quickly enough, the soldiers would kick at them to encourage them to move faster. Some guards had also been instructed to physically assault certain prisoners so as to reduce them to a state of complete physical collapse and thus make them more amenable to interrogation. Frequent beatings coupled with exhaustion and starvation were all carefully used tools to ensure prisoners cooperated with their interrogators. Whippings also made up part of the guards' cruel repertoire of tortures, a fact that Inspector Hayward initially considered unbelievable until Scotland Yard interrogated former guards who corroborated the allegations. Along with the physical torments, prisoners were also psychologically tormented, with threats to arrest, torture, and murder the wives and children of prisoners being encouraged, so long as they were never actually carried out. To a prisoner who was being tortured and beaten daily, however, such threats were likely completely believable. Prisoners who were deemed uncooperative during their interrogation were taken to a special punishment cell, where they were stripped naked and repeatedly doused with freezing cold water. The punishment would continue for weeks, even as temperatures outside dipped well below freezing. Prisoners were also handcuffed back to back and forced to stand in front of open windows in the middle of winter. Frostbite became extremely common, and many prisoners lost several toes and fingers, as well as a more delicate appendage due to the torture. One victim of the cold water treatment was an anti-Nazi who had already spent 2 years in a Gestapo prison camp. After the British prison was broken up and its survivors sent for medical treatment, he would be checked into a hospital where he weighed barely more than a skeleton. This former anti-Nazi would go on to say that during his imprisonment by the Gestapo, he had never undergone treatment like he received at the hands of the British. One NKVD officer captured and interrogated by the British at the Bad Nenndorf camp claimed that he had been strung up by his wrists during his interrogations, and weights were added to his legs. His toenails were ripped out, and British officers would beat him with rubber truncheons. While Inspector Hayward's investigation would not find evidence to support this, the dozens of skeleton-like inmates that were taken for medical treatment after the camp's closure in 1947 attest to the very real possibility that this story was as true as many of the other verified accounts of torture. The investigation into Bad Nenndorf would eventually lead to the court-martial of Commanding Officer Colonel Tin-Eye Stevens, as well as Captain John Smith, the camp's medical officer, and interrogator Lieutenant Richard Langham. Many of the guards and interrogators who had carried out beatings and other punishments were given pardons in exchange for evidence or testimony against their former officers. The trials were held completely in secret, and to this day, the British government refuses to allow for the publication of photos of the inmates as they were being rescued from the camp. Information can be difficult to ascertain on this secret British torture camp, and given the extremes of the abuses that took place there, it's not surprising at all that the British government would continue to keep a very tight lid on one of the most shameful chapters of its post-World War II history. After Bad Nenndorf was closed, another British interrogation center was opened at the military base at Gütersloh. The inmates were suspected Soviet spies, and when it was demanded that drastic methods such as those used at Bad Nenndorf should not be used, its commanding officer complained that if each prisoner was to have his or her arrest justified and that torture was not used, then there was little point in having an interrogation center at all. A statement that perhaps best exemplifies the British attitude on torture in the years after World War II. In the end, 372 men and 44 women would pass through the Bad Nenndorf interrogation center, with many dying from starvation, exposure, or torture. The atrocities had been preceded by an interrogation center in London known as the London Cage, where German POWs Jews had been beaten, deprived of sleep, and even threatened with execution. As terrible as the abuses of London Cage were discovered to be, however, Bodendorf would stand in a league of its own. And as a shocking contradiction to the idea of a democracy-loving Britain fighting to conquer the worst evils Europe has ever endured, do you think torture is ever justified? And when does interrogation turn into torture? Let us know in the comments. And as always, if you learned something from this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.